Right, okay guys, it's time for the second walking talking mock of this year. This one hopefully will be a bit quicker than paper one because there's not as many annoying source questions or exam technique stuff. I should be able to run through the second one quite quickly. So this is paper two. Paper two has two exam papers in it, remember. You have the Cold War and you have the Anglo-Saxons. The examiners will not tell you when to change. You have 1 hour 50 total, which means you have about 55 minutes on each, but be wary, they will not tell you when to change. So you do need to keep an eye on the clock. I believe it's a 9 o'clock in the morning start, which means 9:55 you should roughly start to change over. The Anglo-Saxon paper is exactly the same style of questions you've seen on medicine, so we can do that a little bit quicker. The Cold War has entirely unique questions, and just a quick heads up, I'm going to do a video as well on knowledge for the Cold War and Anglo-Saxon, because this paper is far more about knowledge than technique. So please go and watch the knowledge videos on Cold War and Anglo-Saxon. They should be up already. And also I'll try to get to some knowledge while answering this paper. So although it's technique, we'll go through a lot of knowledge as well. So question one. It used to be explain 2 consequences. Now it is explain 1 consequence. Each consequence is worth 4 marks each, meaning a total of 8. So it's essentially 4 times 2. Remember, a consequence is something that happens after an event. It's a result of an event. That's very important. You remember that? Also, remember, consequences can be good or bad. Sometimes coming from a school, you see them as bad, but they don't have to be either. Just a quick heads up about a consequence. It doesn't mean anything that happens after. So, for example, if you look at Cuba, just as a random example, and you have the Cuban Revolution, then the Bay of Pigs, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you said a consequence of the Cuban Revolution was the Cuban Missile Crisis, that would be wrong, because you've missed a stage. So when we say consequence, we mean the next direct thing. So a consequence of the Cuban Revolution would be the Bay of Pigs. A consequence of the Bay of Pigs would be the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you jump a stage, you won't get the mark. So I focus quite a lot on topic 3 on this walking talking mock, 'cause I think a lot of us struggle with topic 3. So first question I've given you is explain a consequence of Reagan becoming president. So Reagan was president of the US in the 80s. He became president in 81. And a consequence of that could be that increased tension between the two sides, because Reagan was very openly critical of the USSR, and this led to a second Cold War. So I start with my consequence, very clearly stating it. Always start 1 consequence was, and make sure you always begin with that sentence starter. So I put 1 consequence was the start of the second Cold War. And this is because when Reagan became president, there was this idea that tension rose dramatically again. Then you give some evidence. So what did Reagan do to cause the Second World War? So you basically give evidence that explains your consequence. Don't give more than 1 consequence. You're much better off explaining 1, because that will get you 4 marks. We don't want to see you explain 2. You don't need to write a page. You just need to fill in the box. Should not be writing too much for a 4 marker. So I said that Reagan was harsher towards the Soviet Union. He called them the evil empire, and he abandoned détente because in the 70s things were calm. Reagan massively increased US military spending. We think it got to about $1 trillion, which was about an increase of around 13%. And he announced this program called SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, which you may remember from lessons was this weird thing that's never actually been proven, where there are lasers in space that can shoot down opposing nuclear weapons. This pressurized the USSR, to give up the arms race, and led to a rise in tension. So I've basically given a consequence, and if you don't know much about Reagan, have a read through this paragraph. Second one I've done is the creation of the Soviet satellite states. So again, you'll get 2 different consequences now. The Soviet satellite states are when the USSR took over Eastern Europe post-World War II. So think about it. What did that do? When Stalin took over the creation of these satellite states, well, what did that do? Well, it increased tension between America and Russia. So my consequence, increased tension, 1 consequence of between the USA and USSR. And now I'm going to give evidence to support it. So why were the USA unhappy? Well, Stalin took control of countries in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. They became communist states. If you remember back to the Yalta Agreement, Stalin said he wouldn't do this. He said he would give them free elections. So this went against the agreements he made, and it worried the Americans that Soviets were going to continue to expand. This divided Europe. there was a clear communist East, capitalist West, which, once again, going back to my consequence, increased tension. And I've thrown in a little bonus fact there for Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. So essentially, you have to give something afterwards. This question is not what was the creation of Soviet satellite states. You may mention what it was in your evidence, but it must link to your consequence. Remember, a consequence happens after the event, and it must be directly after. It can't be like 10 years later or something. We're looking for short-term, immediate consequences, and you will get 2 questions. One on one consequence, another on another consequence, 8 marks total. Now we get to the most exam technique heavy question. This is the one that you can get really badly wrong if you don't pay attention. So first things first, a narrative account is like a historical story. Every good historical story is almost like a timeline. We go from start, middle to end. You must end your story. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a very good story. It's a historical story, so we're not making up things like it was a bright sunny day. We're not using alliteration. It's pure facts, all right? It's a historical story, essentially, an analysis of what has happened. They will give you 2 bullet points for this question, which is nice, so you can use them to help. They are often in chronological order, so Castro comes before the Bay of Pigs. And the important thing about this story is that I would lay it out into 3 paragraphs, start, middle, and end, and I would almost do it like a flow chart, where you have start, middle, and end. But notice the arrows, because the important thing for this question is 2 things. Number 1, your answer must be in chronological order. So it has to be start, middle, and end. You can't go middle, start, end, middle, start. We don't want to tell a story backwards. It must be from beginning to end. And secondly, you must link your story together. History is connected. This links to this, which links to this. So whatever your question is, we need to see chronology and we need to see it link. Linking's really easy. Just remember a couple of phrases like this led to, or as a result of, phrases like this. And we want to use these link terms over and over again to show how all of our events link together. The next most important thing on this question is you must look at the dates. If you write outside of the dates in this question, you will not get the marks. So if you talk about what happened in 1958, you will not be graded. If you talk about what happened in 1963, you will not get the mark. If the question only has 1 year, for example, let's say it was about the Hungarian uprising in 1956, you start in 1956 and you end in 1956, but you still tell the story in order. So you must focus on these dates. When they give you dates like this, 1959 is your start, 1962 is your end, and it's vitally important you don't go outside these dates. So this question is, write a narrative account analysing the key events in Cuba from 1959 to 1962. Cuba's not come up for a few years, so I have a feeling Cuba may come up this year. In 1959, what happened in Cuba? The start, well, hopefully you know, it's the Cuban Revolution. This is when Fidel Castro overthrew Batista. After that, you have the Bay of Pigs, which occurred in 1961. So that's your middle. And then you end with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So start, middle, end. And I'll show you how you would do this. And what I'll do is I'll highlight 2 things. I'll show you knowledge in order, and I'll show you links. I'll do the knowledge in one colour and the links in a separate colour, so you get the idea. So again, if you don't know this topic well, I'm covering 3 topics here, so you should get some good knowledge on Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Cuban Revolution. So in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban dictator Batista and established a new government. The USA was unable to respond, but relations got worse when Castro started to take over American-owned businesses and land in Cuba. So Castro, basically America loved Batista, but Batista was a bit of an idiot, a dictator, and Castro took it over and he then got rid of American businesses. America controlled things like Cuban sugar, for example. They bought a lot of Cuban sugar and they owned things like Cuban electricity. The USA were worried that Castro was going towards communism and therefore they refused to buy Cuban sugar. Here's a nice little link. Because they refused to buy Cuban sugar, Castro asked the Soviet Union for support. And the Soviet Union gave them economic aid and they formed a closer relationship. This worried the US as it meant there was a communist ally of the USSR was just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So what does Kennedy do? He launches the Bay of Pigs. This is our event 2. This is our second event. Remember, we want 3 events for this question: start, middle, and end. To get full marks, you need 3 separate events, which is why 3 paragraphs works well. But the Cuban Revolution and Bay of Pigs aren't separate topics. Because of the Cuban Revolution, Kennedy launched the Bay of Pigs. They link together. So we'll put our link there. This led to Kennedy proving the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was an absolute disaster. Kennedy basically invaded Cuba with 1,500 Cuban exiles. Exiles are people that were booted out of Cuba because they were not fans of Castro. The idea was the exiles would land at Bay of Pigs and they would start a revolution. However, people didn't like them. People liked Castro. The Cubans didn't like Batista. The invasion was poorly planned. The Cuban people did not support it. In fact, Kennedy even cancelled air support because he could see how badly it was going. And Castro's army immediately defeated the invaders. A major embarrassment for the United States, a really, really, really bad moment in US history. And what happened next was Castro became worried about the US invading. So if he's worried about the US invading, he might turn to Khrushchev for more support. Khrushchev did start sending more support, and another nice little link there. He started sending military resources, and then he went a bit too far, and he started sending nuclear weapons in secret. Now we go on to our stage 3, which is, this led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you could get a whole question on the Cuban Missile Crisis. This particular exam question I've given you is about other events, but you could easily get a narrative account on just the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you need to know enough about the Cuban Missile Crisis to be able to tell the story from start to finish. This is more of a quick summary. So on the 14th of October, American spy planes discovered Soviet missile sites. They took pictures of it, and they informed President Kennedy on the 16th. And the actual Cuban Missile Crisis lasts 13 days, the 16th to the 27th of October, 1962. So if you've got a question just on the Cuban Missile Crisis, you would start here and end here, depending on when the dates were, of course. If the dates went to 1963, you would talk about the Hotline Treaty as well, because that was in 1963. You can split the Cuban Missile Crisis into 2 weeks. Week 1 is where they decide, what do we do? Week 2 is where they basically carry out that plan. So they decide to blockade in week 1, and week 2 carries out the blockade. Kennedy makes that decision on the 22nd of October. He goes on TV and he announces a naval blockade of Cuba. He actually called it a quarantine because a blockade is technically illegal, but Kennedy wasn't too worried about that. This should prevent further missiles from arriving, but it doesn't get rid of the missiles that are already there. There's quite a lot of tension. Again, if this question was just about Cuban Missile Crisis, I would go into more detail. On the 24th, the Soviet ships respect the blockade, but there's a lot of tension around it. America goes to DEFCON 2. The crisis ends. Remember, we have to end our story. It's very important we end it. On the 26th, Khrushchev sent a message to remove the missiles if the USA promised not to invade Cuba. The deal almost seemed too good. The deal was the USA had to not invade Cuba. I mean, that's not exactly much to give up. And the USSR would agree to remove the missiles. Almost sounds too good. And in fact, it was too good, because the following day, Khrushchev sent another letter saying, actually, I've changed my mind. We need you to do all of the above, plus I want you to remove your missiles from Turkey. Kennedy was a bit worried now, because he knew if he removed his missiles from Turkey, it would look like he has lost. So he makes a very clever agreement, and he publicly accepted it. But he said, we will remove them, so these missiles from Turkey, 6 months later in private. This brought a crisis to an end. So again, I've gone start, middle, end, and I've told the whole story, and I've linked it together. You need to be very, very careful here with your dates. Don't talk about anything that falls outside the date. Then you only have one more question. It's quite a short paper. So for this particular question, you get a choice of 3. So you have to answer 2 of 3. So make sure you plan. Sorry, there's a page here I've missed. So make sure you choose your favourite 2. The ones I've given you this year are questions that have not come up for a while. Basically, these are consequence questions with a focus. The way I teach this is it's why was X important for Y? And X is your event. So something like Truman Doctrine, Hungarian Uprising, Treaty, Marshall Plan, whatever. Y is something like, how did the Cold War develop? Or how did it increase tension? Or what did it do for Eastern or Western Europe? And it's so important you focus on the why. Because the question is not, why was the Truman Doctrine important? The question is, why was the Truman Doctrine important for the development of the Cold War? How does the Cold War develop? The second question, why was the Hungarian uprising important? Well, no, it's not why it was important. It's why was it important for how the Soviets could control Eastern Europe. Last one, I don't think this will ever come up as a question, but I've thrown it in there just in case to give you a bit of knowledge. There was a treaty in 1987. Again, the question is not why was that treaty important, it's why was that treaty important for relations between the superpowers. Just like in medicine, if the question's on treatment, you need to talk about treatment all the time. Whatever the question is on, could be on either of these, it could be on other things like division between East and West, whatever it's on, you must focus on this. And you do 2 PE paragraphs per question. That's how we try and teach it. So 2 different reasons why Truman Doctrine was important. 2 different reasons why the Hungarian uprising was important. I've given you answers for all 3 just to give you some knowledge, but in the real thing, you only pick 2 of them. So why was the Truman Doctrine important for the development of the Cold War? So the Truman Doctrine was important for the development of the Cold War because Harry Truman laid out the USA's plan to contain communism. Now we give some knowledge about Truman Doctrine. Europe was in economic ruin. It could have changed to communism. Stalin was starting to take over countries, and Truman knew he had to support these countries to prevent them from falling under the communist sphere of influence. What did the Truman Doctrine do? Well, it led to eventually the Marshall Plan. Truman announced in the Truman Doctrine that he would give $400 million to Greece and Turkey to help them fight against communist rebels. By doing this, he abandoned the previous policy, and essentially this led to the development of the Cold War because Truman was now following a policy of containment of Soviet expansion rather than isolationism. Containment is the idea, remember, that Truman says you contain communism. We won't let it spread any further. The second reason I've said is because it increased tension. So my second reason why it's important for the development of the Cold War was because it increased tension. Now I need to explain why. So Truman didn't describe communism very well. He described it as the will of the minority being forced upon the majority. He spoke very negatively of communism and said capitalism is good, communism is evil. It made it very clear that basically the big 3, America, Russia and Britain, were now, in America and Russia's case, direct opponents. Some people would say Truman Doctrine was the starting point of rivalry. It led to the Marshall Plan, which provided nearly $12 billion. Stalin responded to the Marshall Plan by setting up Comecon. He responded to the Truman Doctrine by setting up Cominform. And what does that do for the development? It increased tension and it divided them both as superpowers. So I haven't just said why the Truman Doctrine is important. I've said what it does to develop the Cold War. For example, Truman follows containment. It increases tension. It's important. Remember, if Truman Doctrine is X, it's not just why the Truman Doctrine matters. It's not question 1, like the consequence question. It's why was the Truman Doctrine important for why? So you need to keep talking in your answer about how the Cold War developed or whatever the focus is. Second question I've done, and I've tried to keep these short and sweet just to give you some knowledge, is why was the Hungarian uprising important for the Soviets being able to control Eastern Europe? So right, the Hungarian uprising was important because it showed that the USSR were going to use military force to maintain its power. So the Hungarian uprising was when the Hungarians were unhappy with their system of government. They were unhappy being communist. They wanted to rebel. So they did. They tore down the statue of Stalin because Stalin was recently died. So Khrushchev was in charge, and Hungary believed they might get some freedom under their new leader, Imre Nagy. But in reality, Imre Nagy tried to leave the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets invaded. So let's give some knowledge about the Hungarian uprising. It was 1956. Khrushchev sent 200,000 Soviet troops because he wouldn't let them leave the Warsaw Pact. 2,500 Hungarians were killed. The uprising was defeated. But okay, why is it important for Soviet control of Eastern Europe? Well, because other Soviet countries see this happening and think we don't want to be like them. So it sent a clear message to other Eastern European countries that if they attempted to break away, they will be met with brutal force. So again, I've answered the question. Second reason why is because did America get involved? No, because they only want to contain communism. They don't want to change countries that are already communist. So America did not get involved. This helps the Soviet control of Eastern Europe because communist satellite states know America is not going to help them. So it's important because it showed the West would not directly challenge Soviet control. So how did America respond? Well, they condemned the actions, but they didn't intervene. Containment means they would not help a country that was communist. They will only help countries who were not communist. Why did they not help? They were scared of a nuclear war over Eastern Europe. Why is this important? Well, the Soviets realized they can basically do what they want to Eastern Europe because they realized that America was not going to get involved with Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., etc. So the Soviet Union now knew they could act harshly, which helped them maintain control over the region. Question is again on Soviet control. Did the Hungarian uprising increase tension between America and Russia? Yes, it did. Have I mentioned it here? No, I haven't. Why not? Because increased tension between America and Soviet Union is not to do with Soviet control. So can you see, you don't just put everything about the Hungarian uprising, you put the bits that are relevant for this. If this question said, why was the Hungarian uprising important for tension? Then I would mention how America were unhappy. America were very disappointed and increased tension between the two. But I don't really mention it here because I'm focusing on how the Soviets controlled Eastern Europe. I'm going to whiz through this question, and you might want to pause it and have a quick read of this answer. I do not think this will come up as a question ever, but it is on the specification. So I thought I'd throw it in there. In 1987, there was a treaty signed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. Ronald Reagan signed it with Gorbachev, the USSR leader. There's a question here, why was it important on the relations? So it was important because it was one of the first times they signed a reduction, meaning they were working together, and I've given you some facts here about it. I'm not going to go into great detail about this question. I don't want to spend too long on it. But why was it important for the relations? Because it improved them. It reduced tension. It was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev. It eliminated some nuclear weapons. It got rid of these missiles. It also helped to remove certain weapons, which reduced the risk of a nuclear conflict. It basically decreased weapons, but also showed that the two sides were willing to engage in negotiations. Therefore, it made the relations better. Similarly, it showed that the two sides were now cooperating rather than arguing. It was the first time in the entire Cold War, the INF Treaty, that nuclear weapons were actually destroyed. SALT 1 and Détente just limited ones that had already been built. This one actually gets rid of them. It led to further treaties on the course, such as the START negotiations, and it proved that the superpowers could work together. So working together, improving relations, leading to the end of the Cold War, that is all about relations between the superpowers. I don't think this question will come up, but if you're a little bit worried about it, feel free to pause the video and take a look at some of the information there. That is all there is for the Cold War. 3 questions. You'll notice there is literally zero help on the entire paper except 2 bullet points for the narrative, which means it is vital that your knowledge is good because you don't get much help for this particular paper. This next paper, I should be able to whiz through quite speedily. And again, I'm expecting you guys to pause it, go back if you don't know a topic. If I say something you don't know, don't just watch the video and then go, oh, I don't know that. Pause the video, go and actually learn that particular topic because all of this could come up. And in fact, I'm predicting there's a higher than 0 chance it does come up. So Anglo-Saxon is the exact same as medicine section B. You have a 4-mark question on features, a 12-mark essay, and a 16-mark essay. That is all there is. You've done these questions before. So let's rock and roll through them nice and quickly because you've done these before. You did the feature last time. You should remember you are 2 sentences, feature followed by facts. So you start with a feature, and then you go for a fact. I've given you the question this year, describe one feature of the Anglo-Saxon legal system. So the Anglo-Saxon legal system, you could mention the blood feud, you could mention the Were Guild, you could mention the hue and cry. I've mentioned the Were Guild as my feature. And now, what is the Were Guild? Guild actually came from the word tax. It's where you had to pay compensation to the victim's family if you murdered someone. Bit strange, but that's how they handled their legal issues. Murderer's family had to pay compensation. There's my feature, and there is my fact. Second question, I've deliberately chosen horrible questions here, guys, so don't hate me. But because if that comes up, you will thank me. So one feature of the forest laws. So William created the forest laws, for example, the New Forest. It meant only the Normans had the power to hunt in these areas. Sometimes it was only William. And if any Anglo-Saxon people were caught, they could be punished badly. So one feature of the forest laws was they banned ordinary people from hunting in these royal forests. There's my feature. And my fact is, if they were caught hunting, they could have their fingers cut off or blinded. There's my fact. If that comes up now as a feature, you will do very well because you can hopefully just remember that answer. Right, I've chosen the 12 marker that I keep thinking is going to come up, and it hasn't come up for a couple of years, so maybe this is the year. When William won the Battle of Hastings, he did not instantly become king. In fact, they made Edgar the Atheling king until the earls in England, they submitted, so they gave up, they gave in, WWE style submission. They gave in to William in 1066, which made him king. So explain why the earls submitted. It's quite a tough question, so hopefully if it does come up, you'll be nicely and prepared. So there's lots of different things you could talk about. You could talk about how good William is at Hastings. You could talk about how he made them submit in London. You could talk about the earls who did submit, like Edward and Morcar. You could talk about Edgar the Atheling giving up. You could talk about the English not being good enough to compete. So I've put them into, again, you need a really, really good point. Remember, same as medicine, 3 PEE paragraphs. I've come up with 3 points for this question. My first point is going to be William's strength. So William being really, really good, and that's why they gave in. My second reason is going to be how William marched to London to get them to submit. And my last reason is going to be because the Anglo-Saxon leadership was really bad. Whereas William was good, the Anglo-Saxon had no real leaders left. No introduction, no conclusion, just straight 3 PEE paragraphs. You got lucky on medicine with a good question on germ theory this year. So let's hope the 12 marker in Anglo-Saxon is similarly nice. As I did last time, I will highlight point evidence explained into separate colours. I do want you to go away and pause the video if you're not sure about this question and read through this answer. So one reason why the earls submitted to William was the strength of William's position. There's my point. Now I need to talk about why William was in a strong position. They were scared of him. He defeated Harold Godwinson at Battle of Hastings. He's an excellent warrior. He proved he was an effective leader because he defeated Harold at Battle of Hastings. After he won the battle, he seized Winchester, which gave him lots of money, which enabled him to reward his followers. He was in a strong position. Why did that position matter? Well, the earls submitted to him because they didn't believe they could compete with his leadership. Because they didn't have this treasury, they couldn't reward their followers. The earls could not raise an army, and they were scared, let's be honest, to fight William. So they submitted to William. Again, linking back to the question. So William's in a really strong position. That's why the earls submitted. Second thing I'm going to talk about is his march on London. This is the hardest paragraph that a lot of you would have forgotten. But William doesn't instantly march to take the throne. He actually goes on a little bit of a walk and then gets to London eventually. But on that march to London, he does things like build castles and harry a lot of areas. So my point is William's march to London. Now I need to give facts about the march to London. So after Hastings, he didn't instantly become king. The Anglo-Saxons did not surrender immediately, so William needed to force them into it. So on the way to London, he destroyed loads of land. He killed lots of villagers. He built castles. He built property. He forced the people in these areas to give in and submit to him. Rather than go straight to London, he actually marched to a place called Berkhamsted. He was actually met by Edgar, Edward and Morcar, who all submitted to him. So why did his march eventually get them to submit? The earls were worried about the power of him. He had already forced all of the south to surrender because he built castles and burned property. He threatened to cut London off from the rest of England, and the earls were forced to submit. So if you're not sure about this topic, again, pause this and have a quick read through it. Remember, I've deliberately picked a harsh question, so hopefully you get a nicer one. Final paragraph. Another reason was the Anglo-Saxons just didn't have any good leaders. Think about the Anglo-Saxon leaders at the time. They were basically a teenager called Edgar the Atheling. He wasn't good enough. He could not leave a country. The other two senior earls were Edward and Morcar. Well, Edward and Morcar couldn't even defeat Harold Hardrada. They lost at Gate Fulford. They are not going to command the respect of the country. They lost to Harold Hardrada and Tostig at Gate Fulford. So no one's going to back them. What about the best Anglo-Saxon soldiers? Well, they died at Hastings. They weren't available anymore. And many feared William because they believed that God was on William's side. That's why they believe William won the Battle of Hastings. So think about the position the Anglo-Saxons are in. They're not in a good position. They couldn't raise an army to compete with William. They had no strong leader. There wasn't another Harold Godwinson in the country. If they wanted to keep some power, if they didn't want to be killed by William, they had to submit. Because if they fought him and lost, they would be killed. So basically, Edwin Morcar and Edgar decided to submit. So they basically kept their lives and kept their jobs. Very tough question, the submission of the Earls. It is a topic on the specification, so it absolutely can come up. If it does come up now as a 12 or 16 marker, there's your 3 reasons, and hopefully you've got more than enough knowledge to get full marks from what I've just gone through. So you might want to pause it, you might want to learn those facts, make flashcards, etc., so you know why the Earls submitted. For a 16 marker, I will give you 2... remember, you get a choice, so you pick one 16 marker. I've written this one out and we'll plan this one together just so you can have knowledge if both of these questions come up. Remember how a 16 marker works, same as medicine. You have an intro where you make your opinion and give your criteria. Do you agree or do you disagree? The way we like to teach this, well, if you mainly agree, then you basically you agree to a strong extent. If you mainly disagree, then you only slightly agree or you agree to a limited extent. That's the way I like to do it because you want to weigh up both sides. Then you do the same, you do 3 PEs, but this time they must either agree or disagree with the question, and you finish by repeating and stating your arguments. So I would plan this question like this. Agree, disagree. So the question is, the number one reason why the rebellions of 1068 to 1071 failed, and hopefully you can remember that the Anglo-Saxons, there were some rebellions. There were rebellions in the north. There were rebellions down south at the Isle of Ely. There was rebellions with Edward the Morcar, rebellions with Edgar the Atheling. The Vikings rebelled, Hereward the Wake rebelled, but all of them failed. And the question is, the main reason why they failed was because of William's actions and leadership. So there's your agree paragraph. Basically, William was the reason why they defeated the rebellions. Remember, the first bullet point will always support, so the harrying of the North can support this paragraph on William. But the other reasons why I think it failed, this would be a disagree, was the English had no leaders. The English were weak. So I might talk about the Anglo-Saxon leadership being really bad. And my third paragraph might be about how there was just no Anglo-Saxon support for the rebellions. People didn't want to get involved. They were scared of William. Overall, though, I think William is the reason they failed. And remember, you need a criteria. Why is this more important than that? Well, my argument, and again, I planned this before the question, is why do you think there was a lack of support? Because they were scared of William. Why do you think the leadership was bad? Because they were scared of William. So my criteria, my rationale for agreeing with the question is because these Anglo-Saxons were scared of William, therefore I agree to a strong extent. And let's show you how this looks in an actual essay. I agree to a strong extent or a large extent, but the main reason why William won, or William defeated the rebellion, was his actions and leadership, because he intimidated the rebellions. There's my point 1. There's my agree point. I do need to give the other side of the coin, though. I need to give the balanced argument. However, this was not the only reason why. Now I'm going to signpost. I'm going to tell the examiner what I'm going to talk about later on. My second point is going to be the lack of English leadership. And my third point is going to be the lack of support. So there's my second point. There's my third point. In your introduction, I like to call this the idea of a signpost. You tell the examiner what you are going to talk about in the essay. So let's give you the difference between a 16-mark PE and a 12-mark PE, just like medicine. So we start by stating our point, William's actions and his leadership. We then give lots of lovely evidence about what William did. So when Edwin and Morcar revolted in 1068, William led an army northwards. He built castles quickly in Warwick and Nottingham. He made them surrender. When there were rebellions in 1069, you might remember this very popular topic to study, William killed a lot of people in something called the Harrying of the North. He was so annoyed by the rebellions, he burned down the homes, he destroyed the crops, he killed the animals, he salted the earth. He dealt with these rebellions brutally. And the last rebellion, he crushed Hereward the Wake's rebellion at Ely by forcing him to surrender and punishing them badly by cutting their hands and feet off. So why did this defeat the rebellions? William's action and leadership were important. He dealt with the rebellions quickly, prevented any further rebellions, intimidated the locals. Therefore, I agree this was the main reason. Continuing my argument, I agreed here and I continue to agree here. However, just because I agree doesn't mean it's the only reason. So now I'm going to give the counterpoint. So maybe if it wasn't William, what else could it be? So remember, my second point was the lack of English leadership. This is my point too. So why were the English leadership so bad? Well, Edward and Morcar surrendered without even fighting. They were weak. There was no leader in England to replace him. Edward and Morcar were not strong warriors. They were defeated by Harold Hardrada at Gate Fulford. They have submitted, given in to William. They are not strong leaders. Edgar the Atheling was young. He was not a warrior. He could not inspire the population. The rebellions were spread out. There was no clear leader organising them. They didn't all happen at once. They weren't coordinated. They were sporadic. They were random. There was no clear leader. There was no clear timings. So this, in my opinion, is another reason why William won. So I've explained this was important because if the English did coordinate their attacks, William may have struggled to win. Instead, because they were random attacks, William could pick them apart one by one. However, for a 16 marker, especially you grade 7 to 9ers out there, we need to say, well, why do I think that William's leadership was more important than the lack of English leadership? So I've said I do not think this was more important. I believe it was the actions of William who prevented the lack of English leadership because there were no English leaders because they were scared of him. So I'm saying, yes, the English leadership matters, but I believe that my initial point is more important. Therefore, I agree because I think it was William's strength that caused the lack of English leadership. My final point, remember, was on the lack of support. The lack of English support. So why was there a lack of support? Well, there was a lack of support for the rebellions. People were scared of William. The rebellions actually tried to get some overseas support from the Scots and the Danes, but they couldn't build a big enough army. When the Danes actually arrived to support Edgar the Atheling, he attacked Kent. However, William paid the Danes to leave, and the Danes were happy to go home. The Danes actually came back down in 1070 to help Harold as well, but once again, William was able to pay them to go home. And in fact, the Danes, realistically, were more interested in getting treasure and money rather than actually defeating the king. So without support, they cannot win. So again, I'm going to explain. This was important. Without support from the English people or the Scots or the Danes, the rebellions were not powerful enough to defeat King William. Now I'm going to do my comparison again. Why is my first reason more important than my third reason? Well, I'm saying because I believe it was William's strength that prevented a lack of English support because they were intimidated. And William's actions were very clever. If he didn't pay the Danes, maybe they did invade and maybe there would have been more support. So it was William's actions that stopped the Danes. All I do now is I repeat my argument. So in conclusion, I still agree to a large extent. I've maintained the same argument. The rebellions failed because of William's actions and leadership. Yes, there were other reasons. Yes, they were important reasons, but it was William's actions that resulted in the lack of English leaders. It resulted in a lack of support, and therefore I agree to a strong or a large extent. The main reason was William's actions and leadership. So you can see I've very, very clearly answered that in the introduction, and then I've continued the same argument throughout. Just before we get out of here, because it will annoy me if it comes up as a question and we don't do it, let's plan this question very, very quickly. So imagine the question is about how the Normans changed England. Of all the changes the Normans made, the most important was the changes to the church. So they changed the church. So our agree is going to be the church. If you can't remember how they changed the church, again, pause the video, go and revise it. But they replaced the Archbishop of Canterbury, the AOC. He was a man called Stigand. He was Anglo-Saxon. They replaced him with a Norman archbishop called Lanfranc. That was a really big change. They did that because they accused Stigand of being corrupt. They accused him of things like pluralism, having more than one job, and simony, giving jobs to other people for money. They also built more Norman-style cathedrals. So you could argue there was quite a lot of change to the Norman church. However, I'm going to disagree. I'm actually going to use the second bullet point here as my point. I'm going to disagree and say the feudal system was also a huge change. So remember, the feudal system was this big system where you had the king on top. He owned the land. Then you had the barons or the tenants in chief in the second bit. Then you had the knights, and then you had the peasants or the villeins at the bottom. And the idea of this system was that the king would loan land to the tenants in chief would loan land to the knights would loan land to the peasants. In order to get the land, the tenants had to provide homage or loyalty, swear an oath. The knights had to provide knight service. I think it was 40 or 45 days. Might want to double check that on Google after this, of knight service. And then the peasants had to work and provide labour service for the knights. This was a huge change because previously England had things like earls, thanes, churls, peasants, slaves. Now this is what the feudal system looks like. My final change I'm going to talk about, and again, if you don't know the feudal system, you know what I'm going to say, pause the video, go and learn it. The other major change they made was to land. So what did they do to land? Well, they brought in the forest laws. That was a big change. They got rid of the Anglo-Saxon earls eventually, and they replaced them with Norman earls. They also made the earldoms a lot smaller, and this was to prevent the king having less power. He didn't want powerful earls like Harold Godwinson was. Overall, my personal opinion in this one I agreed to a strong extent. This one I would agree to a very limited extent, because I think the changes to land were more important, just my personal opinion, than the changes to the church. And the reason why is because religion still stayed roughly the same. They didn't change the religion. They were still an Archbishop of Canterbury. They were still cathedrals. Yes, they were different, but it was relatively similar, whereas land completely changed. The earldoms were made dramatically smaller. All of the Anglo-Saxon earls were replaced with the Norman earls. I think this is a more important, more significant change that impacted more people than this. That's your 16 marker. That's your paper. It's a long one. Paper 2, not to worry you, it is the hardest one in history. If you nail paper 2, you'll do very well. Hopefully you got loads of important and interesting knowledge from this video. If there are topics you don't know, please go back and pause the video, read the answers, and last but not least, I will be making another video on knowledge for the Cold War and knowledge for the Anglo-Saxons. So please go and watch them if you are struggling with knowledge. Until next time.